Studies, began the project One Constitution for All Syrians in February 2016. The UN Special Envoy for Syria at the time, Staffan de Mistura, restarted peace talks with the Syrian government and the opposition in Geneva that same month. The opposition included the Kurdish National Council in Syria, KNC, a union of around a dozen Syrian Kurdish parties. The KNC had joined the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces, also known as ETILAF, in 2013. It had also been part of the Syrian Negotiations Commission in Geneva since the Riyadh conference in December 2015. The project is sponsored by the Institute for Foreign Cultural Relations, IFA, with funds from the German Federal Foreign Office, and aims to strengthen the voice of the Kurdish National Council within the Syrian opposition.
The
Kurdish National Council had very little contact with diplomats and journalists. We collaborated with its Committee for External Affairs to run the KNC's Geneva office, which supported the National Council in establishing these connections. While the government could draw on many seasoned politicians with experience in negotiations and working with the media, the Kurdish National Council lacked such experience. Not only that, but it received only limited benefit from the support offered to ETILAF, in part because some of its positions deviated from those of the majority of the opposition. We wanted to compensate, at least in part, for this disadvantage.
Diesen Nachteil wollten wir zumindest ein Stück weit ausgleichen.
The Kurdish National Council was also to be supported in developing viable political concepts for a future democratic Syria. The KNC had made the decision to strive for a federal Syria back in 2012. The goal of the first workshop in July 2016 in Geneva was to work on developing an approach to federalism together with the National Council and federalism experts such as the political scientist Dr. Soren Kyle and the constitutional lawyer Professor Eva Maria Belser. The workshop in Geneva and two follow-up workshops, held in Erbil in September and December 2016, produced a position paper outlining the advantages of decentralized and, in particular, federal structures, as well as the draft of a constitution for a Kurdish region within a federal Syria. The position paper on decentralization states, "The Kurdish National Council argues that in fragile states, which suffered from extreme violence, political decentralization can help to stabilize state and society. Such a concept can appeal to members of all confessional or linguistic groups. Since the development and implementation of a decentralized system with strong local entities is a step in fostering democracy, and at the same time, in securing the unity of the Syrian state. In a decentralized system as we understand it, authority and responsibility for political, fiscal, and administrative questions is allocated between center and periphery. It allows distinct populations or regions to decide certain questions independently from the center, but still in compliance with a national constitutional framework. By conceding real decision-making competence in certain fields to certain regions or provinces, instead of a mere permission for administrative devolution, confessional, linguistical, or ethnic diversity, as well as specific experiences and needs that differ from the experience of the majority, can be considered. In turn, this consideration will create loyalty to the central state. Thus, decentralization has the potential to avoid the constant repetition of separatism and repression, which is no solution for any side. However, on the one hand, a clearly structured allocation of competences and responsibilities is important. On the other hand, effective mechanisms of intergovernmental cooperation have to be developed. This way, confused, ineffective decision-making processes can be prevented. The development of sustainable, decentralized structures is not a question of months, but rather a long, complex process that will require the commitment of all Syrians. In April 2017, the Kurdish National Council decided to present its findings to the other groups within the Syrian opposition.
Neben Mitgliedern des kurdischen Nationalrats
Along with members of the Kurdish National Council, we invited numerous other representatives of the Syrian opposition, ETILAF, and the Syrian Negotiations Commission. We were warned ahead of time that if we used the word federalism, the Arab opposition would immediately get up and leave the room. But in fact, everyone stayed. They were very open to discussing the concept. Of course, not everyone agreed with us. Many participants had their reservations and remained skeptical. But there were some very good, very open discussions. The fact that important functionaries and leading members of the opposition continued to take part in our workshop showed that they were also interested in the topic. For example, at the end of the workshop, Riyad Saif said that he had benefited greatly from the discussions and learned a lot about federalism. Here I can add that over the course of the workshop, most of the participants were able to change their minds and accept the suggestions, should they be implemented. It all depends on the international agreements. In other words, members of the Syrian opposition will adhere to the decisions that international stakeholders make for Syria. But we really do need an overall consensus among Syrians. I don't think that attitudes to the idea of decentralized administration have fundamentally changed, even if it has never been more than a plan B. The opposition has been talking about a decentralized administration since the beginning of the revolution.
تم العمل عليه لأنه تم العمل من بداية الثورة بوثائق المعارضة على مفهوم اللامركزية الإدارية.
Now we are working on outlining an approach to federalism. As a plan B, the idea was of course well received, especially by the members of the Constitutional Committee. But I also think that more attention is now paid to acceptance and inclusion. Although the participants held differing political opinions and belonged to different groups, the overall atmosphere of the workshop was relaxed, and there was a general consensus, which contributed to this new appreciation. The discussions and group work that workshop participants engaged in led to the following consensus, formulated in the Istanbul 1 paper. 1. Syria shall be a democratic state. 2. Syria shall respect and safeguard internationally recognized human rights. 3. Syria shall be a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic and multi-religious state that recognizes the diversity of its population and all segments thereof and respects their right to cultural self-determination. International minority rights shall be guaranteed for all of the country's minority populations. 4. Syria shall guarantee women's rights and ensure the reasonable and proportionate representation and participation of women in all institutions of the Syrian state. 5. Syria's territorial integrity shall be guaranteed and secured by ensuring that all segments of the population can participate equally in the state. 6. Syria shall recognize and protect the rights to self-administration of the following groups: Sunnis, Alawites, Kurds, Assyrians, Turkmens, and Druze. They shall exercise their rights and responsibilities by means of their own institutions, parliaments, councils, governments, and courts, led by legitimate representatives of the respective groups. The regions shall develop their own constitution, which may not contravene the Syrian constitution. The regions shall have their own budget. Their funds shall be provided by taxes and by financial transfers. 7. The organization of the Syrian state shall be based on the division of responsibilities and resources between the national, regional, and local levels. The goal is to develop an expanded form of administrative decentralization that breaks with the tradition of the central state, while at the same time addressing concerns that the state could break apart. The boundaries of the regions must be redrawn and must adequately reflect the ethnic, religious, and linguistic composition of the population. After the workshop, members of the Assyrian and Turkmen groups approached the KNC and the European Centre for Kurdish Studies and suggested organising a workshop exclusively for the groups referred to as minorities, for Kurds, Assyrians and Turkmens. They argued that these groups had certain shared interests that they should initially discuss with one another. This included the definition of rights that would be enshrined in the constitution and could not simply be abolished with a majority of 50+X%. This request initiated the second phase of the project. Between May 2017 and September 2018, numerous workshops were held to enable discussions among representatives and members of ethnic, religious and linguistic minorities. The participants initially developed several papers outlining constitutional principles. The Istanbul II paper of May 2017 alone encompassed 23 points of consensus, and in particular introduced the idea of a bicameral system. Point 12 states, the Syrian parliament shall comprise 2 chambers. In the first chamber, all groups shall be represented according to the size of their population, with representatives elected directly. In the second chamber, each region shall be represented with the same number of delegates. The region shall determine how their representation is to be appointed. The electoral process in the region shall ensure adequate representation for all ethnic, religious and linguistic groups. The Istanbul III paper of November 2017 contained 31 principles and marked the first time that close attention was paid to the composition and functions of the Constitutional Court. Syria has a constitutional court that monitors human rights, the rights of all ethnic, religious and linguistic groups, and the division of power and resources. It also protects the values of the Constitution. The Constitution determines the number of judges, their term in office, and the requirements of eligibility for election. The second chamber elects the judges with a 2/3 majority. An independent electoral commission prepares the election and receives the recommendations from the president, the first chamber, the regional governments, and the ethnic, religious and linguistic groups, the parties and the lower court. During the election and the preparations for the election, it must be ensured that the different regions of Syria and the ethnic, religious and linguistic groups are adequately represented. At least one constitutional judge has to be a native speaker of Arabic, Kurdish, Turkmen and Assyrian. Regions, municipalities and other state actors, as well as natural and legal persons that address a violation of the Constitution, can file a grievance to the Constitutional Court. The grievance can address government actions or non-feasance. The Constitutional Court annuls laws and rulings that violate the Constitution. In the case of an emergency, it reviews the adherence to the emergency laws. Further amendments followed in Bucharest in May-June 2018, including the incorporation of the entrenched principles for the first time. The following constitutional principles must not be limited or repealed: democracy, rule of law, human rights, the rights of ethnic, religious, denominational and linguistic groups, the social state principle, and the federal state. Many participants welcomed the new version with 33 points. The points that have been developed represent cornerstones of a Syrian constitution and of legislation in the interests of all Syrians. They can be used to establish democratic values and to foster a democratic environment in which the rights of all segments of the Syrian population are assured. The professors shared examples and shed light on experiences in Europe and all around the world. This is a real opportunity to benefit from the experiences of other countries and find the ideal solution for Syria. All of this lays a necessary and important foundation for Syria's future. We hope that establishing a new Syria with an end to the war and with a new constitution that we hope will treat all groups fairly will encourage many of Syria's sons to return and contribute to rebuilding the country. This can only be achieved if the Constitution guarantees all rights, including human rights conventions and international conventions on civil rights, political rights, social rights and cultural rights, as well as minority rights. We believe that human rights are not limited to civil rights, but that the future Syrian constitution must include both the rights of individuals and the rights of groups.
نرى أن من الضروري أن يراعى في دستور سوريا المستقبل حقوق المواطنة وحقوق الجماعات بالتوازي مع بعضها البعض.
يعني أنا كأقلية ضمن أقلية كان عندي هي الفرصة إنه اليوم فكر بصوت.
The discussions of issues both large and small and of future challenges gave me, a member of a minority within a minority, the opportunity to openly express my thoughts and thereby overcome my fears. Today we are building the foundation for future generations, to enable the safe and peaceful coexistence of all groups. Democracy is a behavior, not a recipe, and it's a long-term process. We are standing up for peace. We want to see this peace reflected in all people, so that our children can enjoy the diversity of society. We are lucky to have such diversity. Our generation did not have the opportunity to experience the positive aspects of this richness. By this point, the catalogue of principles had become so extensive that workshop participants recommended drafting a constitution based on the principles. This occurred in summer 2018. Two aspects of the draft stood out. Firstly, power was not shared solely on a horizontal level, i.e. between the judicial, executive and legislative branches, but also on a vertical level, i.e. between the centre, the regions and the municipalities. Secondly, the draft included an extensive catalogue of human and civil rights. Both of these features stem from Syria's unique history. A major cause of the current crisis is the concentration of power in the hands of just a few people. This has resulted in the abuse of power, in corruption, and not least in massive violations of human and civil rights in the past and in the present. The goal of the draft constitution is to create a Syria that learns from its past. In other words, to establish structures that help prevent a catastrophe like the one Syria is currently experiencing from reoccurring in the future. The draft constitution was initially discussed in Berlin in September 2018 and in Athens in December of the same year. The workshop in Athens also marked the start of the third phase of the project. After almost a year and a half of discussions between representatives of the minority groups, the sessions were once again opened up to representatives of all segments of Syrian society.
Es war ein sehr wichtiger Schritt, die Diskussion für Angehörige aller Komponenten zu öffnen.
Opening up the discussions to members of all groups was a very important step. Our goal is not to draft a constitution for Kurds, Assyrians or Turkmens, but for all Syrians. Of course, it wasn't always easy to integrate new participants into the debate. Some discussions had to start over from the beginning. Background information had to be provided again, but the work paid off. The additional participants contributed many new and important suggestions, including the idea of adding comments to the draft constitution to explain how specific principles or paragraphs were developed and to note diverging opinions. The preparations for convening a constitutional committee under the auspices of the UN also led to new priorities in terms of who was invited to participate in the workshops. From December 2018 onward, invitations were primarily directed at potential members of the future Constitutional Committee. Members of the opposition, representatives of civil society to be selected by the UN, and representatives of the Syrian government were each to comprise 1/3 of this committee. Before the Constitutional Committee met for the first time in late 2019, a total of 4 workshops were held in Athens, Malta and Sarajevo, with participants including potential members representing the opposition as well as civil society. Despite many heated discussions, the participants agreed that it is important to break taboos and to enter into a discussion that is both open and productive. The discussions were very good, with an excellent exchange of ideas. It was enriching and gave us further insight and clarity on several critical issues, in particular regarding the future representation of Syrian minorities and the protection of their right to participation. This is an important topic that we will continue to work on. This workshop and other upcoming workshops, which I hope to take part in, should result in a constitution that is supported by all Syrians and that reflects their national, denominational and religious identities as well as their rights as citizens. I give this project credit for opposing those who want to present Syrians with a finished constitution. This must not be allowed. Syrians can develop their own vision for the country's future constitution. Many participants particularly praised the open atmosphere during discussions, which allowed everyone to express their fears and reservations. The atmosphere of the workshops encouraged substantive discussions and repeatedly led participants to revise their existing views and seek common ground.
Really, I think the biggest advantage of this particular workshop has been the discussions themselves. So while the facilitators are able to set the scene for a frank conversation or give us background of different countries, I really think the most valuable thing has been getting to know the various opinions of fellow Syrians with entirely, very different backgrounds than my own, and why they believe the things that they believe, and allowing myself room to change my opinions on things. I might come in with a preconceived notion about something, but really listening to someone else to figure out, well, this might be something that never occurred to me, or I really see the benefits of doing it this way rather than that way. And I think allowing this space, a safe space for Syrians to talk together, I think that's really the most important added value of this workshop. So.
The atmosphere was very productive. In the various workshops over the course of the 2 years, many of the participants were persuaded to change their minds on various points. In other words, these were truly substantive discussions. While participants may have entered the discussions heavily steeped in ideology, such as Arab nationalism, they could later perhaps be convinced that federalism isn't all negative, that it doesn't simply lead to the disintegration of the state, but instead that it can open up opportunities for good governance and the inclusion of minorities. I found all of these discussions extremely helpful and was always sure to convey this to my colleagues in Geneva.
Und hoffe, dass diese Diskussionen mit diesen Personen, die jetzt sozusagen aufgewärmt sind für den Ernstfall eines Verfassungskomitees, diese Diskussion dann auch in dieses Komitee hineintragen werden.
These discussions lay a foundation for building trust. I have participated since the beginning and can see that these workshops are helping us find common ground. We discuss our views with one another and explain our vision for Syria's future, how to guarantee the rights of all religious and ethnic groups, and how to dispel the fears that all of the groups have developed. Each group has reservations, and that is their legitimate right. But by coming together and seeking dialogue with one another, I believe that we can overcome these reservations and develop trust in one another. When trust exists, there is space to bring conflicting views together and to build on this foundation. The fact that many participants initially had a negative opinion of federal systems was partly connected to the fact that many Syrians primarily associate federalism with Iraq.
Ich moderiere die Workshops seit 2016.
I have been moderating the
Fast
workshops
alle
since
Teilnehmenden
2016.
haben, wenn sie über
In discussions of
Föderalismus
federalism,
gesprochen haben,
nearly all of the
Irak
participants have mentioned the
als
failure of the
gescheiterten
Iraqi
Staat und das
state
Problem
and the
der
issue of secession
Sezession
as
als
negative
negative
consequences of
Folgen des
federalism.
Föderalismus erkennen.
In my opinion, they are
Beides ist
wrong
meiner
on both
Meinung nach,
counts.
falsch.
First of all,
Erstens ist
Iraq
der
is a
Irak
very
ein ganz
poor
schlechtes
example of
Beispiel für
federalism.
Föderalismus.
In addition to
Neben
the
dem
central state,
Zentralstaat gibt es
Iraq
im
has
Irak
just
nur
one
eine
region,
einzige
the
Regierung,
Kurdish
die
region.
Kurdisch.
The Iraqi
Es gibt
parliament
weder
does
eine
not
zweite
have a
Kammer,
second chamber,
noch gab
and for
es
a
lange
long
Zeit
time the
ein
country also lacked a
Verfassungsgericht,
constitutional
das
court,
bei
which could have
Schwierigkeiten
mediated
zwischen
between
der
the federal
Zentrale
state
und der
and the
Region
region.
hätte vermitteln können.
The law which
Bis
finally
heute
laid
ist
the
das
groundwork for the establishment
Gesetz,
of a
auf dessen
constitutional
Basis
court is still
schließlich
awaiting
ein
ratification.
Verfassungsgericht
But both of these
eingerichtet
institutions, a
wurde, nicht
bicameral parliament
ratifiziert.
and a constitutional
Diese
court,
beiden
are key
Institutionen,
elements of a
zwei
federal system.
Kammerparlament und
Without them,
Verfassungsgericht,
you can
sind
hardly
aber
speak of
wesentlich für ein
federalism.
föderales System.
So in this
Wenn
respect,
sie nicht
the failure
existieren,
of the
kann man
Iraqi state as a
kaum von
whole
Föderalismus
can hardly be attributed to
Insofern
federalism.
kann man das
The second
Scheitern
argument
des
regarding the
Irak
issue of
als
secession is
Gesamtstaat
likewise
kaum
unfounded.
dem Föderalismus anlasten. Auch die
Historically,
zweite
secession has rarely been an
Argumentation
issue for
bezüglich,
federal
des
states.
Problems der Sezession ist nicht begründet.
When secession
Tatsächlich
has
hat es
occurred, it has
in der
typically been in
Vergangenheit
centrally
für
organized
föderalistische
states.
Staaten kaum Sezession gegeben. Die meisten Gebietstrennungen fanden in zentralistisch organisierten Staaten statt.
Of course, this does not mean that the workshop participants have already agreed on a final draft of the new constitution. Further discussion is needed, particularly with regards to the issue of how to draw regional borders, as well as the establishment of quotas for ethnic, religious and linguistic minorities. For many participants, Lebanon serves as a negative example here. But opinions also still differ on the question of which form of decentralization is best suited for Syria. On the one hand, I believe it's really only right-wing nationalist groups that are calling exclusively for equal citizenship without special protections for anyone. On the other hand, I think it is going too far to say that these groups should have more rights than other segments of Syrian society. We have to learn to live together as equals, while also taking care to protect the particular rights of each specific group. When it comes to restructuring the current administrative regions in Syria, two things must be kept in mind. Firstly, decentralization must actually be implemented in geographical terms so as to ensure functional local administration, which allows the practicing of democratic processes at the regional level. This is not possible with the current administrative units. Secondly, we have experienced a long, approximately 10-year conflict, which has resulted in demographic changes. Several parts of the country saw forced displacement. All of these circumstances make it necessary to develop a new vision for the future administrative structure of Syria. We believe that this should involve geographic decentralization. At the same time, we want to stress that central ideas introduced in the Istanbul II paper have been preserved. For example, the Sarajevo paper of October 2019 also envisions a bicameral parliament and describes the necessity of giving up the existing provinces in favor of new regions. The Syrian parliament as a whole parliament shall comprise two chambers, the Chamber of the People and the Chamber of the Regions, or Chamber of the Governorates. The current 14 governorates shall be organized into new governorates or regions. This step must take place at the beginning of the process, since it is a prerequisite for the appointment of the second chamber. The current draft constitution should not be understood as a finished document, but rather as a source that members of the Constitutional Committee can draw from and benefit from in the upcoming negotiations in Geneva. The project, One Constitution for All Syrians, will continue in 2020. Now co-funded by the German Federal Foreign Office and the European Union via the Syrian Peace Initiative, SPI. The goal remains to provide support to the representatives of the Syrian opposition and of Syrian civil society who have been appointed to the Constitutional Committee. The concrete work on the draft constitution has concluded for the time being. The discussion should now be more closely tied to the process in Geneva and the meetings taking place there. In addition, the first workshop in March 2020 is set to address the topic of expanded decentralization. This was prompted by the fact that numerous participants spoke positively about this idea. The goal will be to identify overlaps with the current draft constitution and discrepancies between the two. At the same time, it will be important to cultivate the same efficient methods and positive atmosphere for discussion that characterized the workshop in recent years. What distinguishes this workshop from other workshops is that we focus on practical matters here. This means that we come to a conclusion and put something down in writing. This is important and leads to a clear vision rather than vague ideas. Even if I myself am not convinced that this vision will ever be realized, it is still useful to have it there. Asking these practical questions and discussing the various opinions is key. It is necessary, healthy, and critically important. I think the current workshop was an important addition. I've been following these workshops for more than 2 years and was able to be there for many important discussions which naturally help us move forward in Geneva. The participants have been specifically selected so that they can later incorporate the results of these discussions into the work of a Syrian Constitutional Committee, should the Geneva process ever lead to the founding of such a committee. Discussions have ranged from questions of identity and issues of decentralization to how the state should treat minorities and what the state should be called. I have always hoped that these many productive discussions, which I have listened to at length, could someday take place in Geneva in the same form, with the same seriousness and with the same participants, though of course with others too, with the entire Constitutional Committee. This will hopefully make it possible to contribute to the development of a decentralized, democratic Syrian state, with a political structure that is fair to Syria and its people. Syria has unique characteristics, just like every country, whether in terms of culture, politics, economics, or geography. No matter the successes and positive experiences that other states have had, I believe that Syria must find its own path. It is a very long and difficult process, but these workshops, in particular our current workshop, help tremendously by bringing experts and participants together to develop new ideas. We hope to continue this dialogue and develop these ideas further.